Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final collaboratory conversation topic on the topic of virtual education, well-being, and equity during the current global health crisis. I'm excited to welcome all of you here this afternoon. My name is Charlotte Jacobs, and I am the co-director of the Independent School Teaching Residency Program here at Penn GSE. It's a teacher education program for novice teachers who are interested in teaching in independent schools. And I also teach in the Urban Teaching Residency Program here at Penn GSE. So before we dive into the content of today's conversation, I would like to set a few norms for our time together. So there are over 200 people who are registered for today's session, which is really exciting. And this also necessitates us establishing some ground rules for this conversation. So first, please keep your audio and your video muted during the panelists' presentations. If at any time you have technical issues or need assistance, please send a chat message to Nicole Carl, who is our tech support for today. Our time together will include hearing from each panelist for approximately 10 minutes. During this time, if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to use the chat box to log in your questions and direct the message to me, Charlotte Jacobs, the moderator. And then I will use that to have our opening Q&A at the end of our panelist conversations. Taylor Hausberg, who is our participant liaison, will also be taking notes throughout the different panelist conversations as a way to track our conversation as well. So you will see that appearing in the chat box. After the whole group Q&A, we will devote our remaining time together to small group breakout discussions, where you will have more time to talk about what the panelists presented today, to offer questions, reflections, and thoughts for moving forward. So we're really excited for all of you to participate today in our conversations. As someone who studies intersections of identity development and equity in education, I am thrilled to moderate today's conversation, focusing on addressing issues of educational equity during our current health crisis. Equity and access, as all of you know, have been ongoing issues in the US education system. These issues have been even more pronounced and devastating during the current health crisis that we find ourselves in. Addressing these challenges during the current school closures and going forward is going to require a multi-level response. And so that's why we've invited 3 panelists and experienced educators who work on educational equity from different perspectives to help us consider strategies and approaches for combating these challenges. And so I'm just going to take a couple of minutes now to introduce each of our panelists before we get into the conversation. Our first panelist is Dr. Kalila Harris, and she is the Managing Director for K-12 Education Policy at the Center for American Progress. She holds a law degree from the University of Maryland School of Law and a doctorate in educational leadership from the University of Pennsylvania. In addition to her background as an attorney and researcher, Harris brings grassroots experiences from founding a Baltimore City school focused on social justice and co-founding a local community collaborative called the Coalition of Black Leaders in Education. She organizes nationally with the EduColor movement and served as the first deputy director at the White House Initiative on Educational Equity and Educational Excellence for African Americans under the Obama administration. Welcome, Kalila. Siobhan Savage is our second panelist, and she is the principal of Henry C. Lee Elementary School in the School District of Philadelphia. She is a graduate of Penn GSE's Teacher Education Program and Penn Law. After working as a lawyer representing school districts and other educational institutions, Siobhan decided to pursue a principal certification and has been serving as the principal of Lee Elementary since 2016. In that role, Siobhan has worked hard to develop what she calls neighborhood cultural competence in order to foster a school climate where parents feel she is available to them, where Lee is viewed as a safe and suitable place for their children, and where the community actively participates as stakeholders. Last year, the Philadelphia Academy of School Leaders named Siobhan a 2019 Neubauer Fellow for her critical and transformative school leadership. Welcome, Siobhan. Our last group of panelists is headed by Dr. Gerald Campano. He is a professor and chair of the Literacy, Culture, and International Education Division at Penn GSE. For close to 10 years, he worked as a public school teacher, during which time he garnered District Teacher of the Year awards and was a Carnegie Scholar. Dr. Campano's scholarly interests span elementary literacy teaching, critical ethnic studies, immigrant education, and practitioner and participatory research approaches. Throughout his academic career, he has been interested in universalizing research as an epistemic right through community-based inquiry methodologies premised on an ethics of care and interdependence. Dr. Campano will be presenting with two of his doctoral students, Ankita Kurta and Graciel Stauffer Reyes. So now on to our conversation. We have asked the panelists to speak to the two following questions. The first question is, what are some of the most pressing equity issues that you've confronted during the current health crisis? The second question is, how can educators address these issues or diminish their impacts? And so we will first begin with Kalila Harris as our first panelist. Kalila, go ahead.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. And let's see, it is 3 o'clock. Good afternoon, everyone, even if you're on the West Coast. So thank you for allowing me to be here today. I'm delighted to be able to talk with you all about educational equity here in the face of the COVID pandemic. So why don't we kick off with what we know right now? We know that there were 13 million children living in poverty prior to the pandemic. We also know that there was a $23 billion gap between expenditures on predominantly white schools versus predominantly non-white schools in the public school sector. There was about a $1,500 per pupil difference that we could see that EdBuild found in over 1,000 school districts between schools that were within a 2-mile radius of one another, dependent upon race. And we also know right now that we have about 40% of students in a number of school districts who have not been accounted for at all. So what does that mean? That means that some students joined distance learning at the very outset of their districts moving into that format, and then they've dropped off and have not logged in again since the first week, or there are thousands, if not millions of students who have not checked in at all. They may be foster youth, they may be experiencing homelessness, or their family situation as it relates to the virus and people who they might have to care for make it impossible for them to access education. And that's all prior to the digital divide. The digital divide we see is canyon size. What we know is there's a $4 billion estimate to bring digital access to all corners of the country. That's both in urban cores and in rural communities. Policymakers and advocates are requesting that amount through the E-rate program in the next stimulus that comes forward. The CARES Act is by no means enough. It is definitely a scratch on the surface when it comes to response. We're clear right now that there are going to be massive shortfalls across states. And we also know that state education funding did not reach pre-recession 2008 levels up to present day for 50% of the states. So 50% of the states did not adjust their education funding to resume as the economy started to spring back from the 2008 recession. Last but not least, we know that another spike is inevitable. Right now, we've seen today, based on a leaked document from the CDC, that it's anticipated somewhere around 3,000 to 4,000 deaths from COVID daily up and through June. Yet we see there are states that are beginning to open up beaches, open up different retail establishments and other things that will lead to a false sense of security absent a vaccine or an approved protocol for treatment of the COVID-19 virus. So with all of those things said, next slide, the question is, how do we stabilize? And so when we move from response to stabilization, we want to know what should happen next. Well, first and foremost, Congress has the best capacity to be able to fill gaps between those state budgets and the drop off in receipts that they will have, whether it be from economies being shut down, from the stock market being low, or from people who are frankly just not able to work. Congress sees across, the federal government sees across all 50 states and our territories, and they are best equipped to be able to fill those gaps so that states can stabilize and then begin to look forward to how they use equity as a structure for all that they do. So equity has to happen at the center of our work, and it has to happen all the time, not as a tag-on. Community resources should be seen as assets, whether it's rec centers, churches, whatever the case may be. We know that our families learn in many different locations, not only the four walls of a school building. So it's incumbent upon us at this time to architect new ways of schooling with the understanding that learning does already happen in neighborhoods, and it must be imagined from a vantage point that the future for a large portion of the school year next year will be in some form of distance learning, some form of using the community as a classroom, some form of relying on parents and other community members to do some of the teaching that our students would normally get in our classroom setting. We also want to think about different ways that we structure the school year and structure the school day, because doing things on an electronic platform is very different than in a classroom. It can feel like there are additional hours on the day because using electronic forms of communication, particularly when using video, can be stressful. It's stressful for us. It's certainly stressful for me. I had to ask my assistant to remove all video conferences that were not necessary with external parties and do them as conference calls, since that's what I would be doing normally, because it has been exhausting. We also want to make sure community members are design owners, advocates, researchers, policymakers, educators. We all have to do the work to equip and facilitate community control over schools. The idea of going back to what we had before is not only inappropriate, but it would mean that we do not care to fill gaps in equity, especially equitable access to opportunity for all of our students, whether it be by race, by income, students with disabilities, students experiencing homelessness and foster youth, as well as LGBT students who school might be the safest place for them to be. We want to make sure that the community owns the process and feels ownership in the process, not that they're asked for advice despite being experts on their own children and communities. We cannot continue to use a deficit lens when we're building schools. And we know for the past 3 decades, in the public arena, education reforms have been done to communities and not with them. There's been this persistent state of buy-in instead of collaboration and co-creation of what schools should look like for students. Mastery over content coverage. Lots of people are saying, well, how can we promote all students? We can promote all students because they're all at the same place. They all, in March, stopped schooling at the same point. So the idea that somehow grade level is this magic structure is nonsensical. We are not in a situation where students need to go grade by grade to show proof that they've covered content. Instead, we need to start looking at what mastery of skills and concepts will look like by band and by developmental need. And we do know that grade levels are really an artificial structure. We need to go back to what we know about how children learn, rely on structures that are already working, like the Montessori structure, and make sure students have a pacing that keeps up with their peer group, but isn't designated by artificial grade level. We don't want students going back to school taking their state tests. The state tests, for the most part, were not real-time examinations and will not provide for students to be able to determine where they are and have their families and teachers know how to proceed with them. We need to have tests that are adaptive and simple, not 2, 3, 4 day long tests that are really draining the young people. Instead, we need an assessment or a series of assessments that allow educators to best support our students. And then lastly, in terms of infrastructure and human capital, my team at Center for American Progress is thinking through something called an opportunity core. We know we're going to have high school students and college students who are coming into a job market that many of us have never seen before. We can use their intellectual capacity to support schooling. So to the extent that parents need help with using technology, to the extent that we need translation services instead of having children translating for their parents, to the extent that some students need small group breakouts and could go with either a high school student or a college student to a park and do a tutoring session, those are all things that we can create this core to both help reignite our economy and make sure schooling is happening in a way that's conducive to students who may have been behind previously and prior to the pandemic. We want to make sure that we also have enough people who are doing social emotional learning and supports. So we need an influx of social workers and therapists, but we'll also need people who can supervise them. So infrastructure needs to be put in place for that. We think there should be funding in any stabilization project to be able to fund both an opportunity core for high school students, college students, and former paraeducators, as well as guidance counselors and other forms of therapists who can greatly expand and support the trauma that not only our students are experiencing, but frankly, our faculty are experiencing, yet they were thrown back into a situation to teach in ways they had not taught before. Next slide. Last but not least, what's possible for our children? Here's what we know. Prior to the recession, we're not yet there yet, but prior to the pandemic, we needed to be expending at least 3 or 4 more times than we were currently expending in federal dollars on education funding. And again, as I said at the outset, the federal government has a clear view across our 50 states and territories. The fact of the matter is you saw almost every Democratic candidate talking about either tripling or quadrupling Title I. Title I may not be the best vehicle because the formula in many ways is about equality and not equity, but we need a vehicle to vastly increase the number of dollars the federal government was contributing. We need to double down on equity, not pull back from equity like we saw in the 2008 recession. We had a 5-pronged strategy in a report we released last year called A Quality Education for Every Child with the Center for American Progress. The first piece of that was racial equity. The second piece of that was making sure all of our students are prepared for career, college, and civic engagement. The third, modernizing and elevating the teaching workforce. The fourth was investments. So again, going back to the pre-recession funding and doubling, tripling, quadrupling that amount. And then the last, determining how we can take a balanced approach to charters to now make sure we're filling the gaps and providing a quality education for every child. So I will stop there. That was a mouthful, and happy to take questions towards the end.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Harris. And just as a reminder to our attendees, if you do have questions for Dr. Harris, please direct them to me in the chat box privately. Charlotte Jacobs is the moderator, and then hopefully we'll be able to circle back to those questions after we hear from all of our panelists. So thank you, Dr. Harris. Our next panelist is Siobhan Savage. So Siobhan, if you will turn on your video and your mic, and then we would love to hear your perspective.
Hi. Well, first and foremost, thank you for having me today. I really appreciate the invitation to be part of this distinguished panel, speaking about these deep issues of inequity that have been laid bare during this health crisis. First and foremost, I would like to give you just some demographics and background around the school that I am the proud principal of here in West Philadelphia. Lee Elementary School is a very diverse school, pre-K to 8, in an aging school building that has been operating since about 1914 or so. We have 550 students pre-K to 8, which is a large number. And I am glad to say I have some of the best staff in the city. We have a number of specialized programs for students in terms of ability learning difference. And we also have a number of partners and opportunities for our students to actually access what we like to call external opportunities and experiential learning. So it's really interesting to come to this with that perspective and being in a very diverse building in terms of race, ability, socioeconomic class, and also just structurally across the district, the fact that so many of these schools are so different in their demographic. It has been something to something to see in terms of how we implement digital learning moving forward. The things that have been most prevalent for us in actually thinking about this and trying to figure out how to best serve students have been these pressing issues of equity that we have seen. And it's that idea of just racialized historical inequity across the education systems in the country, and also how deep poverty affects what you are and aren't able to do for students, because funding and access are so dependent upon this formula that was created based upon property values. And I'm sure we all know the history of redlining and what that means, especially in neighborhoods where racial divides were really used to justify economic oppression. What we are seeing now is that historical inequity is creating learning loss. So for our students that didn't have equity before, they certainly don't have equity now. And we are seeing that the divide or the chasm is actually deepening, especially when we are unable to fill that at this current point in time. Hand in hand with this like racialized inequity and this historical inequity we see is this hierarchy of expectation, and how we as a society have used expectation or have internalized our own biases to really excuse some of what I believe is criminalistic behavior on behalf of large systems, because we pretty much state outrightly that we do not expect students to engage. We do not expect students to learn. But again, that is problematic because we are not approaching this from a strength-based perspective in terms of families and students, and actually acknowledging that a lot of these families are in situations that have been historically created, right? So what does it mean for us to really wrap our heads around and give, verbiage and knowledge to the fact that a lot of our families that don't have access historically have attended the same schools, lived in the same neighborhoods for generations. And this is a problem that has been created over time. This is not something that they have inflicted upon themselves. And what do we as a society really decide to do about that, especially now that it's become so obvious? And hand in hand with that is the emotional impact of this inequity and how raw it has become in this time, because it's so obvious, especially when you are, a child that goes to a school that is so severely underserved and under-resourced, and or you have friends on Snapchat or Instagram or Facebook or wherever they may go, one of which might be in a private school whose school never stopped for. The children are aware. And I think we need to really begin to address that for them and name that. We need to manage their trauma around that. And we need to make sure we support our families in that. But we also need to really manage the trauma of the adults in this and manage the severe adjustment that our staff, our teachers, our district level administrators have had to make, especially because, in urban areas where we don't have the funds to appropriately resource our schools, staff our schools out, and we're lurching from one crisis to another. How can we actually begin to think about these systems so that we can cure that lurching and cure these consistent jumps from crisis to crisis that are occurring over years and years and years, and begin to be forward thinking about correcting an entire system? Next slide, please. What has come really around for me in thinking about this is, not just adjusting my own perspective around this, but also recognizing that other people around me and the stakeholders in my school community have their perspectives are adjusting as well, because they are now living through a crisis that is unlike anything we've seen before, and they're recognizing, you know, some of the issues that have been brought about with all of this, especially because our community is so diverse. So really talking about and confronting privilege and entitlement, and interesting conversations that our stakeholders have had around really how can those that have help those that don't, without doing so in a demeaning manner and without really acknowledging, well, actually with acknowledging the fact that some of these situations that folks are in are not their own doing, and being kind and respectful in the sharing and the support. There's also been this idea of the growing respect for educators as people are now homeschooling their own children and seeing what a difficult job this can be, especially when, you know, you're talking about you have 35 children in a classroom every day versus you at home trying to work or maybe not work or working split shifts, and you only have 2 or 3 of your own children, and how difficult just that is. So really thinking about how to reframe this so that these folks are, again, viewed as the professionals they are and have always been. And then the connectivity in the daycare to graduate education system, and the fact that we shouldn't just be talking about, you know, pre-K education separate and apart from K to 8, separate and apart from high school. This continuity is continuity. What we have seen is the significant ripple and the effect that not having schools in session, whether they are for the smallest of children or for the oldest of children, has on the entire society. And we need to be cognizant about that moving forward as well. Some understandings that we have also developed as a school community is the idea that, yes, it is racialized inequity, but at this point, it's not just about race. It's socioeconomic, it's religious, it's ability, and our ability to actually serve students from a digital learning perspective that have the most severe of disabilities. And its locations and geopolitics, and that idea that we have not really talked at all about what this looks like for students in rural areas, students that might be isolated due to where they live, and then the politics of that geography and how they can even begin to access things. We hear much less about those students that are not in large urban areas that are significantly under-resourced. The other understandings that we have really started to wrap our heads around are the idea that the funding mechanism, even though we often talk about it in terms of public and charter schools, the divide is much, much larger than that. How students of privilege and wealth are served in independent and private schools and in parochial schools are very different than how students are served in public schools. And then even across public schools, you look at charter and suburban schools that picked this up and did extremely well, that are very, very well resourced versus districts that weren't able to get on board and don't have all of the digital supplies that they need for this to be feasible. Next slide, please. So what can we do and how can we address and diminish the impact? What we have actually been talking about, and I give my children at school credit because they're very, very astute. The language of radical restructuring actually came from a child. How do you radically restructure our education system so we all get what we should have? How do we make it fair? And what does that look like, and who owns it, and how do other institutions affect this? What does it mean? Like, if we make a correction to our education system, do we eliminate the need to have the prison complex? Because all of a sudden people actually have access and they're able to get jobs and crime changes. And then there's that idea around who leads that restructuring and what that restructuring looks like, and the conversation around why we haven't done it yet. Are we so comfortable with what the system has become that nobody wants to really talk about what a radical restructuring is? Some of the work that we have done has been, you know, around reform, has also been around, you know, funding, but how do we make sure that all of our kids get what kids in private schools get? It's a deep question. Also, training. How do we make sure that all of the staff in the buildings and at the district levels are trained in an equitable fashion? And how do we begin to make sure that the talent is spread in a way so that all students have access to these talented educators? And we're not just talking about teachers at this point, but there have been many paraprofessionals and aides, our climate staff, the folks that actually handle discipline, counselors, nurses, social workers, step teams, all of those folks should be trained in a much more even fashion so that they are capable of managing these kinds of crises moving forward, and also in a way that speaks to equity and making sure that they're hearing people and that the voice is even. And last but not least, we need to really begin as a country to again look at content standards. We need to look at screen time recommendations, because in a lot of this digital learning that we have seen roll out, we have lost the idea that kids are not supposed to sit in front of TVs and computers all day, but it's been convenient. And we also need to talk about digital learning standards. How do you deliver really good instruction so that students are learning and can interact in a digital platform? Some of this has felt rushed because we are trying to make sure students get what they need now. But if this becomes a situation where we do have second or even tertiary waves, we need to be better prepared for what this looks like. But the last thing that we've really come to a conclusion as a school community and as a staff is, like, right now we know that equity has to be flexible, and we have to be understanding of, doing whatever we can to get kids whatever they need so that they can maintain their mental health, their physical health, their connection to community and their relationships in the schools, so that as we get better at this, they will remain engaged and we will be able to serve them in a better way moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan. Wow, I have so many questions, just building off of also what Kalila was talking about. So thank you for your presentation. And to our attendees, if you have questions that you would like to direct to Siobhan or Kalila, please make sure to message me privately in the chat box. And we will now move to our third panelist, Dr. Campano, and his graduate students, Anki and Gracielle, for our final presentation. So if you would turn on your video and your audio. Thanks.
I think it should be on. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So first, thank you, Charlotte, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you, Janine, for inviting me, Taylor, for all the work of supporting this. And I'm just really honored to be presenting with my co-presenters on this panel. What they said was extremely edifying, and it's a hard act to follow. But I do believe we're going to share some perspectives of families and communities which may complement what they both have said. And my daughter is slated to go to Lee in the fall, and it's so comforting to know there's such incredible leadership there. So we're going to share a little bit. I need to frame what we're going to share in terms of a research practice partnership we've been involved in for the past 10 years, which is a participatory and collaborative work with families from South Philadelphia as they investigate issues of educational equity and access. And this project draws on decolonial, feminist, and anti-racist frameworks that emphasize the epistemic privilege of those who most directly face oppression. That means those who most directly experience inequity are in a unique position to contribute to our knowledge base in education about it. So it's very much in the spirit of universalizing who is an intellectual and democratizing knowledge production. There's a few aspects of this partnership which are very meaningful to me. It's very much around solidarity. It's members of, for example, the Indonesian, Latinx, and Black communities in South Philadelphia coming together along with students from Penn who are mobilizing their diverse identities, all in support of each other, in support of those members of the community who have already, who are living in tremendous precarity because of undocumented and mixed status, and being from mixed status families. It's also an intergenerational project that involves elders, young people, teenagers, young children, because we believe there is a long colonial history of family separation of which schools have been implicated. And as you can probably infer, this is collective work. It cannot be done without, of course, the amazing families we work with, and also students at Penn, including Gordon Diasa, Chloe Cannon, Jeanette Moon, and of course, Anki and Gracielle, who you'll be hearing from momentarily, and my partner both in research and in life, Maria Paula Giso from Columbia Teachers College. If you can go to the next slide, please. So when the pandemic hit, our work didn't stop. And so under consultation with families, we created online communities of inquiry with the youth that we've been working with over the years. So in real time, they are at once experiencing these inequities related to the pandemic, but also investigating them as members of a research collaborative, which also includes Anki and Gracielle.
Thank you. So hopefully while Gracielle fixes her audio, I'll just speak a little bit about how we've tried to adopt certain pedagogical stances in our work with the youth. So based on our engagements with the youth and the families who are weathering the challenges of the pandemic alongside other systemic inequities, these are some of the pedagogical stances that we have been taking in these inquiry groups that Gracielle began to describe. So in our work, we have tried to center holistic well-being, engagement, and creative expression. We've tried to be responsive to complex emotions that youth are expressing at this time. We've also tried to be very creative to co-design learning alongside the students, especially in this moment when we're untethered to the demands of a high-stakes testing climate. And we've also tried to embrace a degree of uncertainty, which seems to be just a pervasive feature of this moment. And I just want to signal that these are pedagogical stances that are important at all times in our work, particularly as we work alongside communities that survive in very precarious conditions. But I just wanted to mention them today because they've been especially helpful in constructing these online spaces that are as responsive as possible in these moments of crisis and uncertainty. I don't know if we maybe want to go back and see if Gracielle could say a few more words about the online space.
I think Gracielle is going to send me the text of what she was talking about, and I'll put it in the chat box.
Wonderful. Awesome. So then maybe now I'll turn it over to Gerald, who can share a little bit more about the community and also how we might be oriented towards the future as researchers and practitioners.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anki, and thank you, Gracielle. I'm sorry you're struggling with the technology. If you could go to the next slide, please, Janine. So kind of in conclusion, I would like to return to some previous research from this project. So members of the various cultural and linguistic communities in South Philadelphia that we worked with collected original data over a number of years around educational equity. And together they collectively coded the data and distilled it into these 12, what they call demands for the education system. And we believe that these demands were relevant prior to the pandemic. They continue to be relevant during the pandemic, and they're going to be relevant when the pandemic is over. And you can see a number of the specific recommendations that have to do with everything from the importance of schools not policing students' immigration status or their families, the need for teachers to get anti-racist training, the need to create holistic contexts that support students across all abilities. These were brought up by the previous presenters as well. But I might draw your attention to just the most general first demand, which is that all students have access to the same academic opportunities. This has never happened in our country because we have a system that's really based on individual competition and bell curve-like ideologies that absolutely privilege those with the most privilege. And so as we go into the future, what if we fundamentally reimagine schooling to be premised not on an ethos of competition, but really an ethos of interdependence? I want to end our brief presentation by quoting a Maori scholar, Graham Smith, who I deeply admire. And when he was working with Maori students all in the process of going into higher education and gaining access to higher education, he told them, no individual succeeds, no one succeeds unless we all succeed. What would it mean to reimagine our education system with that vision in mind? And I will close at this point and look forward to questions.
Great, thank you, Gerald, and thank you, Anki and Gracielle. So because of time, we are actually, and there were a lot of questions that came through in the chat box, and we want to make sure that we give everyone enough time to be able to talk more in depth about what our panelists have presented. So instead of having a whole group Q&A, we are actually going to transition you into breakout groups, and we will disperse the panelists across each of the breakout groups so that you can talk with them in a more intimate setting. And if there are questions that you have for a panelist who is not a part of your breakout group, we can find a way to contact them later with your questions. So just continue to put them in the chat box. So what we're going to do now is we're going to transition into the breakout groups. The conversation is scheduled to end at 4 p.m. And I'd like to take a moment just to remind everybody that before we disperse, that the Collaboratory's goal is to make these conversations as useful to you as possible. So we also are going to ask you to complete a very brief feedback form, which can be accessed through the chat box that will be put into the chat box. You can access the link there, and it's also on the slide. And we'd like to hear your feedback about today's session and also hear about what you learned during the breakout sessions as well. So as we move into the breakout rooms, I'm sure you all have your own questions, but we also invite you to think about these two questions as well. How can you apply what you have heard from the panelists to your own teacher practice or practitioner practice? And two, what other strategies have you used to address the issues of educational equity during the current health crisis? While you're in the small groups, you are invited to turn on your audio and your video and to engage in the conversation. We also ask that one person in each room volunteer to serve as the group's facilitator, who will keep track of time and encourage all of the participants to share. And finally, before we move out into the breakout rooms, we would like to remind you that if anything occurs in your room that makes you uncomfortable, you are free to leave immediately by clicking on the Return to Main Meeting button. Again, thank you to everyone for joining us, and thank you to our panelists, Kalila, Siobhan, and Gerald, for sharing your wisdom with us.